So welcome everyone to this session of the Global History and International Law Seminar. And today we are going to speak about the international law and the precarity of the Ottoman sovereignty in Africa at the end of the 19th century. To start us off, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Mostafa Minawi and Professor Dr. Cemil Aydin. So Dr. Mostafa Minawi is Associate Professor of History and also the Director of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Initiative at Cornell University. He works on the Ottoman engagement in trans-imperial competition in the Sahara and the Red Sea Basin to provide an understanding of the history of colonialism, different forms of imperial rule, and notions of sovereignties as a process of violent negotiation between Ottoman, European, and African powers at the end of the 19th century. In his first book, entitled The Ottoman Scramble for Africa, published at Stanford University Press in 2016, he argues that the Ottoman participation in the Conference of Berlin in 1848 and 1884 and 1885, and its subsequent involvement in an aggressive inter-imperial competition for colonial possessions in Africa were part of a radical auto-reimagining of this once powerful global empire. So his new book project, titled The Axis of Imperial Power in the Horn of Africa, Ottoman-European-Ethiopian Relations and the Geopolitics of Colonialism, promises to deliver a history of colonial competition in East Africa. So our commentator today is Professor Cemil Aydin. So Professor Cemil Aydin is professor at the University of Northern Carolina. His research focuses on both modern Middle Eastern history and the modern Asia history, with an emphasis on the international and intellectual histories of the Ottoman and Japanese empires. He explores historical processes shaping transnational, racial, and civilizational identities such as Muslim, Asian, African. So Cemil Aydin publishes a fascinating book at Harvard University Press by 2017 entitled The Idea of the Muslim World, A Global Intellectual History. His research agenda really provides a new understanding of the historical roots of the contemporary world order from the perspective of non-Western actors of the Muslim world and East Asia. So our today session is based on the paper of Dr. Mostafa Minawi, published last month at the International History Review. And it answered questions such as, how can we understand the precarity of Ottoman sovereignty in the Horn of Africa at the end of the 19th century in relation to a growing European global legal hegemony? And how can we understand the process of Ottoman exclusion from the family of sovereign nation with all the rights and privileges that belonging to this exclusive group of European imperial states entail? So this session really promised to be fascinating. So thanks so much to Dr. Minawi and Professor Aydin for being here tonight. So yeah, Dr. Minawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is I have a bunch of notes that I will be reading off of my screen. So instead of me staring into the screen, looking at you as I'm reading my notes, I'm going to turn off the screen and I will, and this way you can hear me but not see me, and then I will come back on after I'm done. It's not going to be long. It's probably about 10 or 15 minutes in which I kind of try and summarize some of the arguments and kind of give you a bit more about incentive for me kind of delving into this topic, which is kind of outside of my bailiwick. All right. So First, before I start, I really want to thank Dr. Schofel and a Global History Seminar at Sciences Po for inviting me, especially only 2 weeks after the paper has been published. So I was surprised, very pleasantly surprised, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. I also want to thank Professor Aydin for commenting on this paper and also for taking the time to actually do this. I'm very grateful, and I'm looking forward to his comments. I also want to thank all of the people that have given me invaluable feedback over the past 3 years. I have been working on this for 3 years. It's a little longer than an article usually takes, but it's been an interesting process that ended up with this article that looks very, very different from what I started with 3 years ago, and I'm grateful for that. And finally, I want to thank all of you that are taking the time in the middle of a pandemic, and some of you at 9 o'clock in the evening or later to actually log in. I'm really grateful that you are taking the time, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So I'm assuming that most of you at least have access to the article, which came online. It hasn't been published in the journal, which is a special issue called "The Ottomans and Their Neighbors." But the way the International History Review has been doing it is that every time they're done with one article, they publish it online first. So they're still trickling in, and eventually we'll have the full journal. But for now, it is available. So I assume that you have it. I know I've spoken with a couple of you, and some of you told me that you haven't had the chance to read it yet. So forgive me if I'm going to be too brief. The assumption was that you've read it, and please feel free to ask questions about the actual content of the article if that will help you kind of follow the discussion better. But mostly I will tell you about the motivation behind writing this article as a historian of the Ottoman Empire, and definitely not a historian of international law. I want to make that very clear. I'm a historian of imperialism, particularly Ottoman imperialism in the 19th century, and international law was just something I had to deal with for the questions that I was faced with when I was looking at Ottomans and their interaction with their European counterparts in Africa. After that, I will give you a brief highlight of what the article argues or the goals that it tries to accomplish. And finally, I will share with you a small map that has some of the cities that, or the towns that the article kind of focuses on that you might not know exactly where they are. They're all strategic cities on the Red Sea Basin, but unless you work on that region, chances are most of these cities you haven't heard of. So I brought a map, and I will share my screen then so you can at least get a sense of what we're talking about to get a visual at least. So this essentially came after the publication of my first book, which is The Ottoman Scramble for Africa. The very project came up after this, and it was kind of a natural follow-up, if you will, because the first book, the main thrust of the first book was to talk about the Ottoman Scramble for Africa, but always thinking about the notion of the sick man of Europe and how this is another way for us to kind of talk against this idea of a sick man of Europe. A lot of people have been working on the late 19th century Ottoman Empire, also talking about how it doesn't make sense for us to think of it just as the sick man of Europe or as an empire in decline, but usually a lot of the people focus on internal reforms that were taking place at the end of the 19th century. What I wanted to do with the book when I stumbled on this project taking place in Africa, this expansionist project that the Ottoman Empire was actually embarking on in 1885 and onwards, is to always talk against this notion of the sick man of Europe. That was all that I was thinking about then. But after the book was published, there was a lot of questions that were still left for me to answer about this kind of this shift in the nature of the relationship between the Ottoman state and its European counterparts, and how could it have possibly deteriorated to the level of blatant disregard for international agreements between the European states and the Ottoman states by the end of the 19th century. So for the disregard for international law when dealing with Ottomans, while simultaneously using the language of legality of colonial settlement, was not self-explanatory to me, at least. And I felt I needed to better understand the historical process that led to it, that took us to that place. So for those that work on other parts of the global South and their relationship with European colonial powers, my surprise at the treatment of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century by its European counterparts might come as a surprise to you. There's something about European colonialism that kind of assumes an unequal relationship, or at least we assume that there's an understood unequal relationship between European powers and non-European powers. So it is not surprising that European colonialism would be built on the notion of those that deserve the support and protection of laws, and those that are considered not, and I put this in quotations, not civilized enough to warrant it, whether that is in Southeast Asia or Africa or the Middle East. This, of course, has been dealt with and shown by many historians of colonialism, as well as people that work on the history of international law. So why do I think that the Ottomans were different? Well, from the perspective of a historian of Ottoman imperialism, this exclusion was definitely not self-explanatory, because when we take the centuries worth of agreements between the Ottoman Empire and their European counterparts into consideration, culminating with the 1856 Paris Agreement, in which the Ottoman Empire was ceremoniously, officially incorporated into this new Western world order as part of the concert of Europe, the blatant disregard of Ottoman sovereignty only a few decades after that becomes a lot less expected. So also, if we take into consideration that even after 1885, which is where the article ends, and all the way until World War I, Istanbul continued to be invited to the table as a signatory to negotiations and international agreements that would draw the outlines of a new world divided amongst the various powers, with the understanding that the world was moving towards a hard-to-shake binary of those that get to colonize and those that are colonizable, or whose sovereignty does not necessarily need to be respected. So the Ottomans participated in setting the rules of this game, of this new world order, but they ultimately were the object of these new so-called laws of engagement. This, of course, becomes explicit after World War I, with the rhetoric justifying mandatory rule in the Middle East, the idea of the remnants of the people that were the remnants of the Ottoman Empire being not ready to rule themselves as a civilized nation in a modern world. A reinvention, if you will, of Ottomans as always already outside of European imperial system of rule had to be manufactured and reinforced over close to a century. That is really what I've come to conclude with this article. There was nothing normal or natural or assumed about this exclusion. It actually it involved a lot of forgetting, purposeful forgetting, and reinvention of the Ottomans as an other. So the Ottoman frontiers is kind of the geographical location where I have my case study, and I want to talk a little bit about why am I choosing the Ottoman frontiers, particularly Ottoman frontiers in Africa. So I believe that Ottoman frontiers or frontiers in general, are often places where historical transitions and transitions in relationships between different empires are played out most clearly. In the first book, I work in the Eastern Sahara as one of those locations. And now I am deeply entrenched as I'm researching my new book in a different part of Africa, in a much more complicated place, actually, in the case of the African coast of the Red Sea, particularly the Horn of Africa. Of course, there things are very complicated because sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Sahara is very different than claims to sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire along the African coast of the Red Sea. Because in many ways, sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire is mediated through an autonomous Egyptian provincial government that was at the end of the 19th century still under Ottoman suzerainty, and though effectively occupied by the British since 1882, was still acknowledged by the British as an essentially Ottoman territory. So things are, there's like layers of sovereignty and autonomy that have to be dealt with. So it looks like when you look at it initially, it looks like not the perfect place to actually try and examine Ottoman sovereignty because of all of these layers of complications. However, with the British Egyptian state doing the bidding for the Ottomans, you would think that things get way too complicated to make for a good case study to understand how Ottomans fared in the context of European competition through various notions of international law. But what I found in Ottoman and British sources is that exactly because of these complications and this unusual situation, that the analysis of sovereignty over each case, whether it is Sawakin in what is today Sudan, Zayla in what is today Somaliland, or Musawa in what is today Eritrea, had to be parsed out in the archives and explicitly documented by the governmental officials to make an argument for or against Ottoman sovereignty in each of those cases, giving the historian a window into the details, into the mentality or the process of justification or the system of beliefs that drove the juridical exclusion of Ottomans. Also, because the cases in those areas were not so black and white, it forced the British as well as the Ottoman government officials to internally respond to legal arguments internally. So there's like notes going back and forth and debates going back and forth that are left in the archives for us to actually see how that process took place. There was nothing assumed in the exclusion of the Ottomans, and to admit when and how both, whether there is the British or the Ottomans, were able to ignore the laws when it was not convenient for their own interests. So that's basically kind of a summary of how I came to want to study this topic and why I chose this geographic area to try and do it in. Now, what I will briefly do is try and explain what I tried to do with the article. So I will talk about the questions that I dealt with, about some of the goals and the arguments that I make in the article, and how I went about doing them. Again, it is brief. The assumption was that you've read it, but I'm more than happy to talk more about the substance of the article, not just the argumentation, if you haven't read it, so we'll have a more fruitful discussion. So first, the question that one of the questions that I asked is, how did an empire that did not fit into a European, non-European binary experience international law as an exclusively European tool? Second, how can we better understand the intersection of colonialism and international law at the end of the 19th century when we consider the case in which the object of European hegemonic power has had a long history of participating in a European inter-imperial system of legal agreements? Third, to do that, I first engaged with the history of international law as it relates to peripheral or semi-peripheral states, of course, from a European perspective, in the late 19th century. But here I want to make the case that even though there's a lot of commonality between the Ottomans, the Ottoman case, as well as cases from Southeast Asia and East Asia at the end of the 19th century and their interaction with international law and European hegemony, the Ottomans were actually quite unique. and I kept that uniqueness in mind as I was writing this article. That is what I wanted to kind of, and I think they give us a unique a chance to look at a complicated case in which the two kind of parties to the negotiations of an international law were not necessarily in or out exclusively. The Ottoman Empire held a very kind of liminal position that allows us to kind of explore the questions that otherwise would look very obvious when we're studying other kept the uniqueness of the position of the Ottoman Empire in mind without ignoring its similarity to other cases. Then I highlighted the historical process through which the Ottoman Empire went from being a core member of a new form of imperialism to one that would be actively excluded, all just between the 1856 Paris Agreement and the 1884-85 Berlin Conference of Berlin, marking the transition of the Ottoman Empire from subject to object of European colonialism. Finally, I engage with the case of Zayla, Massawa, and Sawakin, which are all strategic cities on the coast of the Red Sea that highlight the complex relationship between the Ottoman Empire and its European counterparts, as well as Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. So what I ultimately argued is that this case with the Ottoman Empire at its center demonstrates a long process through which a great deal of work and effort had to be exerted by the great powers to undo and forget recent history and slowly recreate an other that allows them to slowly exclude the Ottoman Empire from participating in this new international legal order while maintaining the veneer of legality and order. A process that was ultimately completed in the case of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. Okay, thank you very much. It's briefly what I had prepared, and of course I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have. But and I'll turn it back to Dr. Shofel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Minawi, for your wonderful presentation. So now I will turn it to Professor Aydin. Just a remark, there is a storm in Paris and sometimes it cuts internet. So if I disappear, you can still continue the session because we have other co-animator, but I will be back in any case. But sometimes because of the storm, the internet is cut. So yeah. So Professor Aydin, yeah.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you all. And it was a pleasure to read the paper and hear the brief summary. And there is a storm all over America too. In fact, we need to maybe start with that storm. I think when I was reading Mustafa's paper, it reminded me some sort of similarity that we have a case of a country that is given some sort of legal equality on paper. But despite the legal equality, there is a process of exclusion and discrimination in practice. And that, of course, is happened in history in many cases, and I would like to talk about them, but it's also happened in this country that everybody has legal equality and citizenship, but law is not enough. There are other things going around the law, and you may be still subjected to some sort of exclusion and discriminatory practices. And that, I think, is one of the main messages of this brilliant article. In some ways, it's subject to amnesia, as Mustafa mentioned. I want to start by saying that it's also subject to amnesia in Turkey. So this is a topic that nobody wants to claim or interested in, except a couple of some sort of nostalgist pan-Ottomanists who wants to say that Ottoman Empire existed in Africa, but there isn't much interest in the details and nuances, and people don't have the patience to go through that. But I found extremely insightful the kind of work you did. To frame my comments, I would like to make reference to even the broader picture of where this project fits in relation to many other colleagues who are doing very innovative, groundbreaking work on Ottoman Empire and international law. If I use my favorite metaphor of seasons of Netflix shows, this is somehow, in terms of the Ottoman Empire and the international law, is somewhere in the season 2. But the season 1 starts with, and you start with that, with the hopeful introduction of 1856, which is seen by the Ottomans as a affirmation of legal equality. But in season 1, of course, what is often forgotten, I think you mentioned that in the article, in terms of the narrative distortions that we deal with it, is that we always see in season 1, the Ottomans were outside of it, and then they gradually entered into international law, and 1856 was this celebratory affirmation. But all of our colleagues who are working on the Ottoman side of it, and they still need to convince the Europeanists and international law scholars, was that the Ottoman Empire was never outside of the European international law. They were always been part of it. And you mentioned Karlovitz, but there are now more work on hundreds of legal treaties, of every war with Russia ends up concluded with a treaty with legal agreements on how to treat the prisoners of war, how to exchange them. In fact, wars were not the only form of relationship. There are trade, for example, capitulations show that there's a vibrant trade. People are moving in and out. So Ottoman Empire was never outside of that system. So one narrative distortion happens when to imagine the Ottoman Empire as part of this Islamic war that was outside of the European international law. And it has to be defeated, humiliated, to make it less Islamic so that they are more European. Right? So this is also one of the distortions of the narrative that we are dealing with. On both sides, in some ways, people who are also working on the kind of Islamic history also assume that Ottoman Empire had this kind of Islamic international law, which they abandoned to be part of Europe, which was never true. So the kind of good scholarship that is revising this story, saying that 1856 was not a beginning of something. It's just an affirmation of a very long process. So that's how you start. And then after 1856, which Ottoman international lawyers were very celebratory of, because they knew that they were part of it. They were disturbed by the kind of earlier exclusions, but they hold on to the 1856 as a formal membership into the European club of empires. Then season 2 is a kind of a new process of this relationship where there is a process of exclusion and discrimination after and despite formal membership into the club of international law. And I think your case is a very good example. And neither in Turkey nor anywhere else, people don't know and don't want to talk about the fact that Ottomans were part of Scramble for Africa. So your book was very important in that regard. I have a daughter who did the world history, AP World History project. I checked Scramble for Africa. There is no mention of the Ottomans, even though this is the most popular topic in high school AP World History textbooks, right? That in terms of questions, the students are always asked this question because they were taught this. So what you show here is fascinating, that Ottomans are there. They try to utilize international law to play the game according to the rules of the game and also assert their sovereignty, but they are subjected to this exclusion without any legal declaration of exclusion. So it's basically like when I see the details, it's almost like a bullying. That the Britain, France, and others get together and they say, we can do, your very good example is the hinterland rule, that if you have an hinterland, you can expand to it. And Ottomans, your book showed that they thought Chad is an hinterland of Libya. We have the Senussi order. They have members there. There's a trade connection. I can expand to Chad. And the response is, no, you can't. I can, but you cannot. And there is no answer to why they cannot expand to Chad. And I think that is very important insight, that we need to think about what else was happening in international law. So not everything is on paper. So on paper, they are not excluded. They are still playing the rules according to the letter of the law in that I think that is something that people haven't thought about because we, even in liberal university campuses, we think of racial exclusion as something people who are ignorant, who are childish, who would do it. So all my university presidents or provosts, when they make a speech about diversity in African American History Month, they will be very proud. They will always say, look, in the past, this UNC campus was horrible. We didn't have any African American students. Look what we achieved. We grew up, we became better. So there's some sort of a growing up and becoming better story, right? But your story, your international law shows that actually, no, that's not true. That racial exclusion in international law is not out of prejudice or ignorance. So they are sitting at the same table. They know each other. That the Ottoman diplomats, they're Armenian and Greek. They're also from the same religion. They can speak very good French. The only difference is the fez they are wearing, but otherwise they can do everything that others can do. And it's a mystery why they decided to bully and exclude the Ottomans from the club, because it will have season 3 very grave consequences, right? So it's outside of the scope of your this article, but it was part of your book in some ways, talking about Ottoman Africa in general. Is that by 1911 to 14, and in those 3 years, Ottoman elites will decide that fighting imperialism by universalizing international law, or fighting discrimination and exclusion by universalizing international law, is not working anymore. That they have done everything, and many of the colleagues who wrote on this topic recently showed that Ottomans are actually very knowledgeable about international law. They're using as much as they can, but it's not. When Italy invaded Libya, Ottomans were right, but nobody cared. That Libya ended up becoming part of the Italian territories, and founders of modern Turkish republics were there, like Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and Enver Pasha. Then they decide that they need something else. I think the season 3's plot is very interesting. The Ottomans who defended, who use international law, they decide that that's not enough. They need to play the game of caliphate, jihad, and revolt against imperialism, or alliance with Germany, great power alliance. I think that's an interesting kind of afterthought of how one liminal country like Turkey ended up using both, to sort of using the diplomacy of international law, universalize it. When it's not enough, they try to use great power balance and over challenge by utilizing this idea of a caliphate and Islamic world. But what does happen by the end of what I would say the season 3 is that the story you tell becomes very important at the founding of Turkish Republic. So when Turkey, after the War of Independence, after Wilsonian moment and Bolshevik Revolution, when they end up sitting with the British at Lausanne and gain another set of formal equality about sovereignty, the Lausanne Treaty of 1923 becomes, in their mind, a reaffirmation of 1856. And so they see Lausanne is finally going back to 1856. They're kind of reiterating Ottoman Empire or the post-Ottoman Turkey's equality in international law. And there is fascinating that at that point, they stop becoming anti-imperialist. That they're happy with the deal. So the narrative in their mind is that 1856, what we always wanted, we were excluded. We had this long 60-year war against the system, 70-year war. And in Lausanne, we get back to this equality, and they become very good player in the system. And that's something, in international law, I thought about why Turkey is different compared to the post-colonial nation states like Ghana, Egypt, or Indonesia, because they feel they're one of very few, they're liminal, there's only one, 2, 3 non-European countries who are sovereign. So once they get back to the kind of assurances of equality in international law, they stay there. They don't want to challenge the system. They are happy, they move on. And that I think is something that is explained by your work too, because that's what they always wanted. This chapter shows that the founders of modern Turkish republics, who were also in Libya, like Atatürk himself, they thought of 1923 as a triumph of their project. Eventually, after so much blood and trauma and tragedy. So I think I use all my time. I will stop here to thank you again for alerting us to this story. It teaches us something about how racialization works in international law in the late 19th century. It also teaches us that we have multiple layers of amnesia going on about this story that has to be corrected to get a better global history story. And I want to end with one surprising amnesia that I have seen that the Turkish nationalists have it. And I highly recommend it. There's a movie on Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's life by the celebrated Turkish composer, Zülfü Livaneli. In the movie, there's a very short section on Atatürk in Libya. It's only 1 or 2 minutes, where he's joining in the resistance against the Italians. But then he and his friends then talk to each other. He says, "What are we even doing here? Where is this place?" The kind of the movie was made in 1990s, late 2000. There's a complete denial that the Ottomans were in Africa, even for that very educated, enlightened Turkish intellectuals. And we thank you for reminding us of that forgotten story. Thank you. I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Minawi, do you want to answer?
You need to unmute, yeah.
Yeah, you need to unmute yourself.
What I was saying is that I think we are very much on the same wavelength. So all I did instead of writing is vigorously nod my head. So that makes me feel better, because you'll be surprised at the kind of pushback that you get, particularly from those that are from two groups in very different ways. One is historians that are very invested in the notion of international law as a European property, and its interaction, and there's a kind of a stick to your lane type response that I get, but more directly, it's and in many ways, in a way that actually impacts my life in a more direct way, is the pushback you get from historians or I don't know, they're in Turkey that find an engagement with Ottomans in the Ottoman Empire, with the Ottoman Empire as an imperial force in Africa as threatening, and not just threatening to Turkey, and not to the history of the Ottoman Empire. So it's not an academic question; it's more of a question of treason for even going in that direction. And it both pushes you to think that what you're doing might be important if it gets that kind of reaction from two different groups of people, but it also makes you very nervous. I'm not nervous because every once in a while you stop and it takes you 3 years to write an article, because you're continuously having the voices of people in the African Institute in Turkey in your head, and you also have voices of people going, what are you doing messing with international law? That is, and stick to and this is a direct quote, stick to Istanbul, and that comes from so you get these kind of and honestly, I'm not invested in understanding international law, except as it very much infiltrated the history of the Ottoman Empire as an empire, the history of Ottoman imperialism during this period of time, like basically from about the middle of the 19th century all the way to World War I, even as season 3 comes in. And season 3 comes in, what Jabil referred to as season 3, this idea of this is not working. Literally, they call it a farce at one point in some of the documents. This is a farce. He is telling us that we're having these meetings back and forth. We come with international lawyers that we've hired, that we've trained in Istanbul, and we come with arguments, and what we get back is kind of we hear you, nothing's going to happen to you, go away type thing. I'm exaggerating, obviously. But there is a point in which this sticking, this desperate kind of wanting to hold on to the notion that we can still be part of an imperial system, of a world in which there are empires that dominate and those that are unfortunate. It's very much how so the Ottoman Empire was not like the hero of the small man, which is what they want me to write. It is very much part of an imperial system that's always been part of, and now they are trying to engage with it in a different way. And the more they get excluded or actually pushed to the other side of this argument, the more there is this acknowledgement of we need to go look somewhere else. And what you see is that this idea of going to let's pull out the jihad from our back pocket and let's pull out the caliphate and whatever are very much new. They're not new concepts, obviously, but they're new in terms of like there has been a process in which this had to become how should I put it, reinforce their arguments or reinforce their position internationally, because the engagement that they were so invested in for about 50-year period or more after the legalization of imperialism has effectively failed, even if it's not written on paper. Yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to say.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We will start the Q&A session. So if you would like if you have a question, so just raise your hand, or just, yeah. So I already see one question from Dr. Daly or Sam. Yeah, so yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the article and also your book, which I thought was really fantastic.
Thank you.
So my question is about the kind of third leg of this troika of powers that are operating in the Horn, one being Western Europeans, the second being the Ottomans, and the third being the powers that actually are already there, African states. And my understanding of the towns and kind of city-states that are arrayed up and down the Somali coast and that kind of blur into the Swahili coast is that they were always very aggressively independent, both in their interactions with one another and with forces in the wider world, whether those forces were Portuguese or Omani or whomever. And they might temporarily enter into relationships, including relationships of subordination with those powers, but they were always to achieve some short-term goal. And most of them didn't last for very long. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how these states perceived the stakes of what was going on from their perspective, and whether they saw Ottoman ambitions in the region as qualitatively different from those of Western Europeans, including the British, or not.
Do I answer right away, or
and then
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Daly. Okay, so this is exactly where I'm at right now. I'm up to documents up to here and trying to, because the book is the difference between the first book and hopefully the book that I'm producing this time is that hopefully we'll have a lot more engagement with local powers that are also kind of the voices of local powers that are trying to negotiate with all of the main powers, Ethiopia, Ottoman Empire, but of course, Italy, Britain, and France, and Russia. And what I'm seeing more and more is that what you said is absolutely true, but there is from the perspective of, for instance, the mayor of Zayla, who was who was initially an Ottoman mayor or an Egyptian mayor, then becomes, has an agreement with the French, and then becomes a French council, and so on, is that exactly what you're saying. There is continuously a negotiation that is happening with them and the different powers that want these strategic areas, but it's always conditional. The interests of them maintaining their power as a dynasty or as a caliphate or as a sultanate or whatever it is always the most important goal in what they're trying to do. So the Ottomans coming in and saying, guess what, we're Muslim brothers, let's hang out, is something that the Ottomans do use when it works. So you'll see the correspondences that happen on the ground is, of course, Muslim brothers, where we know it's us or the French. Do you really want the French? That kind of thing. The response is always very measured, and it uses the same language of, yes, you're our Muslim brothers and sisters. But guess what? When they're talking with the French or they're talking to the British, they can just as easily say, we are interested in the notions of liberty that you would allow us to actually. So they use the rhetoric, they bounce it back in whichever way is actually convenient for their local interests that are happening at that time. I don't have. This literally where I'm at right now. I'm trying to also pull the voices out, not from sources I mean, the most I could do is actually go to Zayla and interview people, go to Djibouti and interview people to try and get as much as I can in terms of the memory of or the way the interaction with the Ottomans and other powers during this period is remembered and then chronicled and then taught in those places. The rest is still, unfortunately, I'm trying to pull out from French sources, from Ottoman sources and their men on the ground, as well as from British sources. So it's imperfect, but it's definitely, how should I put it? Like the way you described it is a perfect way, which is it's a third leg of the stool that the story would not be complete without. It would actually, it would not stand. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from Charlie Mayer. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions. This is a great paper. I mean, it sounds like it's a great paper, and I look forward to reading it. And the comment, Dean's comment was beautifully structured. But let me pose a couple of issues, knowing nothing about this field really, but listening to the logic of the expositions. I mean, in some senses, the accreditation of the Ottomans as a power, European power, in 1856, I mean, this is really the result of the fact that the British and French, are need to limit Russian expansion in Europe. And so it is a balance of power ploy in many respects, and may or may not, I don't know, reflect an actual accreditation. I mean, maybe the Ottomans are just a sort of new mercenary army. On the other hand, precisely because the Ottomans are still in Europe after 1856, in particular in Bulgaria, their situation as occupiers, their situation is going to be different. And it seems to me that in some way the exclusion of the Ottomans from the concert of Europe is preordained by that particular situation. Most of the rest of the Balkans has been not Albania, of course, but has been cleared by 1856, and this is still a thorn in the side. I mean, look at Gladstone's rhetoric. I recall it in the 1870s. So I just wonder about whether the Ottomans are really there is, in a sense, a resource in the balance of power, or a thorn in Europeanization, and less as actors in a legal order. I'd also want to know, I don't know much about this, the issues of the capitulations that were involved, and to what extent does this disturb the picture of a sort of full-fledged participant in a European or privileged legal order? So I guess I would like to see you return to this. And one, I was thinking about the comparison with the Japanese, who are obviously not necessarily great French speakers, but who were in the imperial order and then out of it. And it is the fact of what we would think of as bad behavior, whether in European in the European possessions, the Balkan possessions, or in Japan's case, in China, and it does have something to do with the reaction that's solicited. It isn't just, I think, a question of just why one is in and one is out. Can have something to do with the nature of how one acts when one is in, which is not to deny that the Europeans weren't. The Europeans didn't. Well, they were trying to exclude the Germans too after Southwest Africa. So it's the context. I'd just like to hear more. But this is eye-opening for me anyway, which just says how little I know about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I caught three different questions, but they're all in many ways are related. And it's basically I think the big question is, how much were the Ottomans really accepted into the European system even before? And I get it. I get this kind of like the impulse to ask that, because what the actions of the Europeans kind of indicate something very different than what the 1856 agreement has to do. So let's start at the end, capitulations. Capitulations were very much one of the main sticking subjects, if you will, that were supposed to be dealt with immediately after the Paris Agreement in Istanbul, in a conference that was going to take place in Istanbul, to say you cannot actually say that, hey, we are now officially in this new redefinition of what makes one equal versus other. You cannot say that we are now under this new legal order also part of the concert of Europe and thus equal, and we have access to public law, but with the exception of us having these capitulations over your head. So there was going to be a conference that would take place in Istanbul a few months later that never took place. So the agreement was there was going to be step one, and then we're going to deal with all these different things, particularly the notion of sovereignty over subjects. What I mean by that is that along with economic issues, the more important things when you're talking about a sovereignty of a state is the sovereignty of a sovereign over its subjects before they're citizens. And in this case, of course, the Russians say claiming a guardianship of the Orthodox, and the French claiming guardianship over the Maronites, and so on and so forth, that they wanted to actually flip. And so the conference kept getting postponed until it got erased. What does that say about the intentionality of European powers at that time, and whether this was a ploy? I'm not sure I would go that far. I think if you want the Ottomans to be on your side to maintain a balance of power, they have done this before, and they have done it since, in a way that you would offer the Ottomans military or economic support in a way that would make them skew the Ottoman powers from aligning themselves with the Russians at one point or someone else. So that you don't have to make this legal declaration of Ottoman acceptance. So there is something different, but also the very fact that they have to make an announcement, it says that there is something different, not just about what the Ottomans are doing, but also how the Europeans are thinking of imperial sovereignty at that point, and how there's an in and an out, as opposed to we deal with each other, we don't have to recognize each other's sovereignty over territory, but we recognize each other's sovereign. So there is a shift, not just for how the Ottomans are being included, but also how the Europeans themselves, the European powers themselves, are looking at each other. Do they really believe that the Ottomans were a power or not? I'm not sure. Bulgaria, the Balkans. So Bulgaria and the Balkans are not colonial possessions of the Ottomans. let's be like really clear. I'm talking from the Ottoman perspective, obviously. They are as much at the heart of the Ottoman Empire as Ankara and Izmir and Beirut and Tripoli. And so the idea that, the challenging of Ottoman sovereignty is not about actually them saying that you cannot have Bulgaria anymore as a colonial possession. It was never a colonial possession. So the idea for Europeans, this is about actually trying to find ways to take away Ottoman territory using religious justification in different ways at different times, starting as early as 1820, right? So it is, so Bulgaria all the way till 1878, actually even after the 1908, when it officially kind of says, ciao, we're done. Is very much Bulgaria and most of the Balkans, with the exception of a few that were never really part of the Ottoman Empire, at least for any reasonable period, were very much considered by the Ottomans as an Ottoman territory. What do I mean by this? Constitution hits again. Constitution is declared. We have a parliament in 1876, and then there's another parliament in 1908. There are representatives from these regions that are equal to representatives, theoretically, equal to representatives from Istanbul, equal to representatives from Ankara, as well as equal to representatives from Yemen. This is different from Japanese claiming territories as colonial possessions, and it's also different than Ottomans claiming colonial possessions in Africa that are different than the provinces. So there is a clear distinction, at least from an Ottoman perspective, about this, and that taking away of chunks of the Balkans are done, and of course, Leila can talk about this a lot more than I can, but were done, they had to be negotiated and kind of the definition twisted and like twisted all over itself to try and figure out a way in which you can actually take away territory from a sovereign. In many cases, from a sovereign power, at least that you claim as a sovereign power. And so you would do it in very different ways, including having guardianship over a population, or redefining the guardianship as being layered with the Ottomans on top and the Europeans doing what they needed to do. So all of that means that the Ottomans were very much engaged in this process, not just being dictated to or taken away colonial possessions from them. So that is actually part of what I'm trying to argue. The last thing is the balance of power and the Eastern question. I really want it to be very, very, very clear. I'm hoping that one day it will be kind of common knowledge that the Ottomans were not standing aside as the different. We always talk about the Eastern question as this balance of power between great powers. What are you going to do with the Ottoman Empire, and who's going to take which chunk that will make the balance of power shift? The Ottomans were as engaged in this process as anybody else. And the fact that, a lot of what we study and talk about is about how a lot of territory was taken away. But what we rarely talk about that would show us the engagement of the Ottomans is that they were part of this negotiation. So some territories were taken away, others were not, because they negotiated for it, because they believed they were part of this question, and they understood that they were a weak part of this question. I'm not trying to pretend that they had any, but they were very much involved. The balance of power involved the participation of the Ottomans. If we start thinking of it this way, even if we think of them as weak members, whether it's like an Italy, we can then reshift how we think about the Eastern question as being very much a question that involves the object of it as a subject. I hope any of this was clear. I hope some of it was clear, at least.
Let me make a final suggestion. If you wanted to amplify that viewpoint, then look at the treatment of Italy between the secret agreement treaties of London in 1915 and what happens at Versailles, because Italy has a grandiose claim for the Dalmatian coast. It gets some of it. It doesn't get Fiume, which it discovers it once later. So, I mean, in that sense, there's a type of parallel, perhaps. And also you might consider the triple interventions after the Treaty of Shimonoseki that push back the Japanese. There is always, France, England, United States, or France and England are always willing to contest the gains by new parvenu powers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Professor Aydin, do you want to add a comment?
Very nostalgic for me. My graduate student years, I have taken classes with Charlie. Nice to hear the voice. I think what the Ottoman is now trying to do is to make the kind of neo Ottoman scholarship more accepted in the international history scholarship. We have a long way to go, but we're doing our best. So one of them is this idea of standard of civilization, where the assumption is that Ottomans were supposed to fulfill these standards and they failed. But from an Ottoman perspective, it's actually they did more standards fulfilled and the Europeans were not doing the standards. So there's always the Ottoman perspective on these questions. And it's clear now that what is considered as a kind of a generous expansion of the European international society to Ottoman Empire, China, Japan, or Ethiopia wasn't very generous. That those societies, that Turkey, Ethiopia, Japan, China, they were the ones who actually universalized the European international society and international law. So they are the actors, and they may use many different strategies. So in that sense, we may need to kind of revise some of the canonical texts of the field. One last one that I worked on, for example, the Ottomans were always considered as the couldn't overcome their notion of Islamic war, so the Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb distinction, which was never used at all. It's a mystery who come up with this. But the only reason why I mention in this now is that a lot of Ottoman international lawyers say that it's the Europeans who are believing in the land of Christianity, Dar al-Salib. That's very interesting in that sense. It says, you're basically reflecting on your own biases to us. We never did that. And scholars on China actually say the same thing, that China never made that a categorical distinction of the land of civilized versus the barbarians. It was the Europeans who saw them barbarians, but justified why they see them as barbarians by saying that if Chinese were powerful, they would see us as barbarian, and because they were always arrogant. So I guess we will need to work together to kind of synthesize different perspectives from different empires in history.
Thanks. I'll read your book. We have it here. My wife has it in her library. So the idea of a Muslim world.
Oh, thank you, Charlie.
Pick it up, and now I'll go through it. Okay.
Okay, great. Does any one of you have any question? Otherwise, yeah, Farhan Ahmed, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering whether, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I mean, it's very interesting to hear about Ottoman Empire and how it interacted with Europe. I was wondering whether you could say anything about the discussions or discourse that may have taken place within the Ottoman political administrative establishment in Istanbul or between its diplomatic missions in London and Paris regarding the realpolitik and the international law in relation to these contesting claims. Or was the Ottoman position or understanding of this realpolitik and the issues regarding these issues universal within the entire establishment? Or was there a debate and a discourse within the establishment? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's a perfect question. From a historian who's actually going through the documents, that's what I mean. It is, of course, as you can imagine, there's a billion ideas and thoughts about what is it that we're doing and why we're doing it. And so there's back and forth notes about one, whether we should maintain this understanding that a lot of what's happening is a facade. Is very much expressed and documented. And there are then different schools of thought that actually arise in the government. And there are people, and it's kind of, there are people that believe that the only option, that we have no choice but to engage with those sets of rules, and we have to continue to actually perform our engagement. And there are others that believe that a complete disengagement is actually would be more fruitful early on, not just after this project failed. And then there are people that are, as you can imagine, that are saying there are ways that we can actually use our powers at the same time as we are actually exerting or engaging in this performance. I love this word performance, and it doesn't mean, in this case, when it comes to international law, particularly diplomacy, it is a lot of it is performance, and it's performing the performing a sense of participation, whether you actually believe in the value of it or not. I mean, this happens all the time. I've become a lot more alert to it now that I looked at it in the 19th century. But of course, you can see it on TV every single day. But the key is that you continue the engagement for at least the group of people that surrounded Mabain, like the Sultan and his posse. I'm not saying that the Sultan was at the center of everything, but there's a Sultan and his advisory board that really believe that this engagement is not an option. It actually would hurt us, even though our engagement might legitimize some of the things that are happening to us because we're engaged in it. And then there are people that are not as directly involved in international relations between the Ottoman Empire and others that are very much arguing for a disengagement, but they are not engaged with Europeans. They're people that are, it's easy to say, I'm the governor of Yemen. We know what's happening on the ground. The last thing we want to talk about is our an agreement with the British. Focus on us, forget the British and our agreement with the British. So there are different voices, and the different voices is what makes you a kind of, and the debates that happen and then gets you, how should I put it? Can you hear me? It just said that they cannot detect, you can hear me. And what happened? Okay, there you go. It's that those voices going back and forth is that gives you a sense of this process over time and the mentality that actually goes into it, as opposed to, you know what I'm saying? The emotional struggle or the mental struggle that is happening within the different powers within the Ottoman Empire. I ultimately end up talking about it as if it is one kind of, the government versus government. But on the inside, if you look into the chapters in between, there's a lot of this like the position of an Ottoman Empire and how it presents this to European powers is only one position that has been agreed on when there's a lot of different people that are actually arguing for or against engagement with international law on European terms.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Dr. Minawi, for the answer, and also thanks, Farhad Ahmed, for your question. So Farhad Ahmed is a lecturer in public international law at Brak University in Bangladesh, and I think in Bangladesh it's 3 a.m. in the morning.
Thank you.
I'm in The Hague right now.
Thanks for connecting. Yeah, I was just impressed. I was thinking, wow, Bangladesh, wow.
No, I'm in The Hague right now. This sounds just
all right.
Loving it till now.
You should have not mentioned it. Okay. So there's another question in the chat. So it's from Igor. Do you want to ask a question or should I read it? Okay, I will just Igor Brilliant. So okay, normally. Okay, so I will just read it. So it's on. It's about the book of John Darwin. In his book After Tamerlane, he argued that there was no scramble for Africa at the end of the 19th century. So what do you think about his thesis that Europeans, along with Ottomans, have just used legal instruments to divide the continent without actual rivalry? So what do you think, Dr. Minawi, about these questions?
That they chose to, that they used legal, there was no rivalry because they set the rules. Well, from whose perspective is really what I want to say. So yes, there are agreements that there was always chances, even if we're just excluding everybody east of Vienna, right? There are always moments where, you know, they almost, the laws are going to be thrown out and there will be a struggle, and then they would say, no, according to the law, basically negotiations that are happening in the background, which what usually happens, and then they go back and refer to this act to justify what they've done or not. Does that mean that because there was no violent conflict during this period, that there was no scramble? As I understand, from what you've explained, I absolutely disagree, obviously. In many ways, the very laws are meant to hide an already existing violence, and the violence is not so much the conflict between the two parties, but also the violence that is taking place on the ground between the parties that are not privy to be engaged in international law. The scramble has a third leg, as was said earlier by Samuel. So if we just pretend that all of these things are just happening as you know, you take this piece of land and I take this piece of land according to whatever Article 35 or 29 or whatever, then we can pretend that there was no scramble. But I mean, maybe the term scramble is really annoying and which I find very offensive. It sounds like it's a game, but I unfortunately had to find a way to engage with an already known concept for particularly people in high school. I mean, you know, we're so familiar with the notion of the scramble that I couldn't divorce myself from it. And then I ran into a lot of trouble when I tried to translate it into Turkish. It went haywire because that concept is not there. So anyway, I'm digressing.
Okay, great. I don't see any questions, so I will ask my few questions. So the first one would be on the agency. So you are speaking about the precarity of the Ottoman Empire and also the Ottoman-British negotiation surrounding Ottoman rule in Zayla, so in Somalia, and Massawa in Eritrea. So what was the agency behind it? So who were behind this negotiation? So how were they connected? So were they people in Somalia and in Zayla and in Massawa who were discussing with the British, and where were the British? And how were they organized? I think it's really I would like to understand a bit more about the agency first, and then I was listening to your presentation, and I was thinking, so it's the end of the 19th century, and so you have, like you say, you know, in your article, you have a growing European global legal hegemony, but at the same time, in the Ottoman Empire, you have huge political struggles, and I was wondering how this European global legal hegemony reflected on the nation-state building in the Ottoman empires and also at the peripheries of the Ottoman empires. I think at the borders, like you say, because it's really interesting. I would like to see if there is any connections between nation-state building and then in the Ottoman Empire and also European global legal hegemony. So, and my last question would be also about influences of empires. And if we look, for example, at the Japanese Empire, we see at the end of the 19th century, the influence of the German legal constitution, for example. But when we look at the Ottoman Empire, how was the law built and how was also international, what was the model at the end? So you have a trial, if I understood it right, you have the Ottoman Empire, which tried to restructure, but what was the model at the time of the Ottoman Empire, or did they have any model, or so what were the conceptions of this Ottoman, so what was the model of the Ottoman Empire? And that's it. So just 3 questions, because I could continue, but I think.
So thank you so much for your questions. So I have the questions that you're bringing up are being dealt with by a lot of scholars that know a lot more about them than I can, but I'll try and attempt just like a very brief answer. Let me start with the last one, which is the influence of the influence of imperial of different empires and the law traditions of different empires on how public law was going to be was restructured inside of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the influence was huge, but the influence was huge much earlier than the 1900. But it becomes more and more influential, of course, all the way till today. What do I mean by this? A lot of the laws that were adopted either from the French Code or the Swiss Code, or actually, I'm not sure about the German Code, but mostly French and Swiss Code laws were adopted, particularly for things outside of personal status issues, and then they were modified. So they were not adopted wholesale, and that tradition continues till today. Of course, it's, once a lot of those adoptions of laws or codes were modified with the creation of the different nation states, but in many ways the remnants of how they were incorporated during an imperial period and how they're interacting with a modern nation state system is causing a lot of problems in many places, Egypt, Lebanon, to say the cases that I'm familiar with. Of course, Turkey also adopted a combination of French and Swiss code. Beyond that, how that interacted with particularly in the late 19th century with Ottoman law, there's literally books written about it, and it becomes complicated when we take into consideration the fact that it was not just one code replacing the other. It was one code coming in and being incorporated into different ways of actually practicing law. So it wasn't just this idea that there is such a thing as Sharia courts and then there's something else that comes in. It's always been mixed. It's always been mixed between, and the difference between the different legal, Muslim legal courts, as well as Dhimmi courts, the different non-Muslim legal traditions that were incorporated. And then we've got this overlay on top of it. So it's a complicated question. That doesn't mean it wasn't incorporated. Now, the question of international law as it affects, as it intersects with the, the rise of the nation state or nationalism is huge, because it is exactly at that moment when arguments that are being doled out by colonial powers or imperial powers about notions of sovereignty and who deserves sovereignty is interacting with already pre-existing kind of instigations of ethno-religious separatism that was taking place in the Ottoman Empire. That moment, well, it's 150 years of moments in which those two come together, that the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman elite have to then engage with, whether they like it or not, and stuck between their own subjects or citizens and notions of international law that are being pushed by European powers is something that causes a lot of the fissures that happen in different places in the Ottoman Empire. Again, Leila would be the better person to talk about them in the complicated case of the Balkans, but this is of course emerging in the rhetoric of international law, and notions of sovereignty and freedom are coming in to be used by different religio-ethnic groups all the way into World War I, but usually by quote unquote minorities. The third question. I'm lost in my notes. Please remind me of your third question.
On the agency.
Oh, yes. Sad that I would forget that. So the agency of the local people or the local political structures that are in place, particularly in the Horn of Africa, comes into play, as I see it right now, from both imperial sources, so both British imperial sources and European imperial sources, through agreements that they are making with different powers to try and negotiate, to try and play them off of one another for their own political political interests, local political interests. So they are very much engaged. Now, they are not, so when there is what will happen is, to give you an example, an Ottoman representative will land somewhere and make an agreement with a local chieftain, and says that you pledge allegiance to us, at least when it comes to international issues. He says yes. He takes a piece of paper into negotiations with the British to say, guess what? This dude that is living here in this part of Somalia is already a part of our, has agreed for us to be their representative in international matters, and thus we can claim sovereignty over it. But the British did that regularly. So when they would try to talk about territorial possessions, they would first talk about, they would, as you know, they would go in with Somali, particularly in Somalia and along the coast, they would go in with the different Somali tribes and their chieftains and make agreements about providing protection for the people, not their territory. And then they would say, but these people actually occupy this much territory, and since we are their protector, we would. So what am I trying to say with all this? They were not at the table of negotiations. They were definitely part of the negotiation kind of what do you call it, beta, before the agreements between the major powers are done. The major powers are actually dealing with local chiefs, and they are claiming that the agreements that they've made with local chiefs can then impact or give them what do you call it, legitimacy for the claims that the territorial claims that they're making. Of course, that goes against everything that that I've been arguing for. What I mean by that is that this idea that if we think that in an unequal power situation, a powerful empire can ignore an agreement that they've made with a power that is not equal, local powers, of course, happened all the time. But when it was convenient, it would be taken into consideration. When it's not convenient, it would be dismissed, obviously. That, all of this to say is that there was definitely a power differential, but the agency of the locals was always represented. Whether to a successful end or not is a different story.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have here also another specialist. So you mentioned it. So Leila Amzi Erdogdular, who is, you have also worked on Southeastern Europe and also the Ottoman Empire. So do you want to add any comments? Leila Amzi Erdogdular.
Thank you. I just love this. I wanted to say that I really nodded my head, as you saw, the whole time. I very much agree, although working on the other side of the empire in Southeastern Europe, where this diplomacy really takes on another level, because it was a place where in 19th and early 20th century, the Ottomans were not able to sort of physically repossess territories, and diplomacy really takes front seat. So everything you were saying, Mustafa and Jamil as well, really fits into this Ottoman outlook on how to resolve this new situation. Well, not really new, but how to deal with all these ways international law was changing, or even I would say being created and tested on so many levels, especially like for things that I work on, like occupation. And at the Berlin Congress, you know, these protections by different territories, by different empires, like these were all tests, because there was no such pretext or case that they could build on. It was really testing the ways that one can dominate or a territory or just the narrative of what this international law will be. So, I mean, I don't really have much to add in terms of what was already said. It's just, I'm tremendously enjoying this, basically.
Thank you so much for your comments. You are Leila Amzi Erdogdular, so assistant professor at Rutgers University. I saw Charlie connected. Do you want to have any question? Or? No. Okay. So
I'm happy. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, Cemil, do you have any other comments to end the session?
No, I'm also enjoying this conversation. This is very,
Okay.
very good.
So it's very, yeah.
Well, I mean, if I kind of suggest a complementary book that I really enjoyed reading. I just finished Osama Makdisi's last book, The Age of Coexistence, about the kind of Ottoman Arab lands and their imperial structure. So he makes a very good argument that is complementary, saying that there was no one single Ottoman Empire, that the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans have a set of problems internally, but the Ottomanist project was extremely successful in the Arab lands, right? Even the Turkish nationalists forget about this, and it's he's saying that if there's one area where the Ottomanism was most successful, were Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, where the whole ecumenical framework. So the Ottoman claim that we are more civilized than you are. We do not discriminate our own people, and you are the ones who are lynching. And they always say this, of course, in response to the Armenian massacre question, that you're lynching your people, you're massacring your colonial subjects, and then they've always skipped the Armenian thing, talk about all the good things. It shows that there is this struggle on what is the empire, how civilized it is. So they are partaking on that civilizational discourse. And there, if we take, I highly recommend that book. If you take Osama Makdisi's suggestion, they are highly successful at this in half of the empire in the Arab lands. In that regard.
Okay. Great, thank you. So I thank you all for being here today. So I think we can conclude now. So thank you so much, Dr. Minawi, for your presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Eding, for providing the commentary, and to Dr. Daly, Professor Meyer, and Dr. Ahmed also for the presentation, and also, I'll just say Sam, Charlie, Fahed, and Leila also for your comments and questions. I really enjoyed also listening to the answer and the different questions, and also thanks to Igor.